Hey, I'm Teresa Coates. I'm the National Educator for Shannon Fabrics, and I am excited to be here at Missouri Star Quilt Company today to show you how to make a cozy cuddle robe. So today we're going to talk all about the pattern, how you're going to make it, how to work with the fabric, and you are going to be able to make a beautiful robe for you or for your loved ones. So we're going to start today with this pattern that is a downloadable pattern, so you can find the link below. Download the pattern and you can just follow along and we'll make this together. So I want to start with talking about the pattern. So the pattern, like I said, it's a downloadable pattern and it is a kind of one size fits all. It's easy to modify it to make it fit any size that you need it to, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go, but know that it is totally morphable in sizes that you want to use or lengths that you want to do for the sleeves and the length of the robe. All right, so when you're making this robe, you're going to need 3 yards of a luxe cuddle for the body, or a cuddle 3, a cuddle print for the body of it, and then you're going to want to have 1.5 yards of another kind of luxe cuddle for the cuffs and the trims. So when we're starting this pattern, the first thing we're going to want to do is to cut out our fabric, and it's really important that we cut out our fabric the right way. So inside the pattern, it's going to have a cutting diagram for you to follow. So I encourage you to read the pattern all the way through so that you can see what we're doing and how to work it, but make sure that you're looking at that cutting diagram so that you can get the cuts cut the right way. So in the pattern, it'll show you from the main cuddle, which is your main fabric. So whether you've used a cuddle print or a luxe cuddle, that will be the main cuddle. And then you're also going to have the lining cuddle, which is actually all of your bands. Okay, so you're going to want to cut those differently. So make sure that you check out this cutting diagram and cut them correctly. When you are cutting out the fabric, we're going to want to check the nap first. The easiest way to do that is to run your hand down parallel to the selvage edge. So we're just going to run our hand, pet the fabric, for lack of a better word. We're just going to pet it one way and then pet it the other direction. You'll be able to see that the nap will go flat when it's going the right direction. So we always kind of want to mark the fabric and make sure that we know which one is the top and which way the nap is going. So I'm going to unfold this and I'm going to cut out one of the pieces for you to show you how this works. So I'm always going to mark the top of my fabric, and I usually do this with a little arrow. I'll be like, that's the way my nap goes, so that if I switch it over and I pet the fabric down, I know that is the direction of my nap. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trace one of the patterns. In the pattern download, you're going to get a printout with the pattern for the robe front neckline and the back neckline, as well as the hood. The hood is printed out at 50%, so you'll need to enlarge that either on a printer or on your home printer and just print it out at 200% so that it's the right size. When you do that, you'll end up with a pattern that is this size, that is your hood pattern as well as your other two. I've just taken these and put a laminating sheet on them to give them a little bit more stability when I'm using them, but you can absolutely just use them as the printout. Okay, so you can see that I've just taped my pattern together. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trace around this and cut this out. Okay, if you have pattern weights, you can use pattern weights. Otherwise, you can just hold the pattern down, and it's usually pretty good about not moving. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut one at a time here because I want to make sure that my fabric isn't shifting as I am cutting these out. If I stack it and I do 2 layers at once, I'm likely to get that bottom layer to shift a little bit and the sizes won't be exactly the same. Since we want them to be exactly the same so they fit, it's really important to just do 1 layer at a time. You'll do that for all of your pieces. So I'm just going to flip this over because we want 1 regular and 1 reversed. So I'm going to go ahead and trace all the way around that one again. And then I'll go ahead and put my notch mark again, and I'm not cutting a notch in it, I'm just putting a mark because it's one less place to cut the cuddle, which we don't want to cut it more than we have to. All right, so there are 2 ways of cutting out the cuddle, and I can use scissors, micro-serrated scissors, like the Karen K. Buckleys that I have, or you can use a rotary cutter. Both of them will work perfectly fine. With the luxe cuddle, I like to use the Karen K. Buckleys and just cut just the backing fabrics. With the print cuddle, I'll generally just use my rotary cutter. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to cut all the way around this. I've traced the lines with a water-soluble marker. And now I'm just going to follow those lines with my rotary cutter. Cut it right out. Bink. Okay. So I'm going to cut out all of the pieces like this and have everything stacked, labeled, marked, and ready to go before I start sewing. Once we've got everything cut out, we're going to start with the pocket. So it's the easiest, simplest place to start. We're going to start there. We'll learn one of the techniques that we're going to use for the rest of the robe tutorial. So this is very helpful. The pocket is made with two pieces that are cut the exact same size. So the one thing I'll tell you is to make sure you remember which one is your band and which one is the pocket body. Okay, so for me on this robe, the print is going to be the pocket body and the Luxe Cuddle Dazzle is going to be the band. I'm going to sew these together. And I'm going to pin them first, so I'm going to flip them right sides together, make sure that my edges are nice and even. And I'm going to go ahead and pin these. And I'm going to pin one corner, then the other corner. And I do this to hold it so that it stays nice and stable and exactly where I want it to be while I'm sewing. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin in the middle and then pin a little bit more. So one of the things about sewing with Cuddle fabrics is because it's a knit, it wants to move a little bit. So the pins will hold it so it can't move too much on me. It'll be much easier to sew if I pin a little extra. So I'm going to do what I call double pinning and do a second little row right here, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew this with a 3.5 stitch length. I've got polyester thread on here and a 90-14 stretch needle. It's really important to use a needle that is made for working with knit fabrics. That includes the stretch needle. If you don't have a stretch, you can always use a ballpoint or a jersey needle, but you want to make sure that you're using a needle that is designed for using with a stretch fabric. Put it down just a little bit. I'm going to drop my needle with the hand crank, take out my pin so it stays exactly where I wanted it to be. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch, and then I'm just going to go forward across this whole way. And as I get to each pin, I'm going to take it out to make sure I don't run over any pins. And I'm going to keep that second pin in to hold it for as long as I can. Take this out, and as I get to the end here, I'm actually going to repin just a tiny bit at the end just to make sure that it stays where I want it to be. I'm going to sew all the way to the end, do a little back stitch to secure it. All right, so once I've gotten to here, I've got my pocket and my pocket band. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my pocket band over, and I'm going to pin these sides. I want to create a little band here that will have a finished edge at the top, so I'm going to fold my seam allowances toward the band and keep the raw edge just past that seam. I'm going to go ahead and pin so that it holds that seam allowance right in place. And I'm going to go ahead and pin a couple more times, and then do that on the other side as well. Okay. All right. So once I've gotten that one pinned in place, I'll do the same thing. Pin and pin. And then I'm going to do something a little bit different. When I sew this, I'm not going to sew just the sides. I'm actually going to sew all the way around. And this is going to create a folding line for me later when I put on the pocket. So it seems like an extra step that might not make sense now, but it totally will later as you get to it. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to stick it in, Go forward just a little, do a back stitch, and then sew all the way around. So as I'm doing this, I put my pins in a little bit differently this time, and that was because it was a short seam. Okay, I'm going to make sure I can walk over this little seam, so if you need to help it through, you can. And then I'm just going to feed it through all the way around, just stitching through one layer that's going to give me a nice little turning spot for when I'm sewing this pocket on later. When I get to the corner here, I'm just going to stop, lift the foot and pivot, and sew to the next side. And again, I'm just going to make sure that everything is where I want it to be, and then I'll sew over that layer. Go ahead and backstitch. Okay. All right, so now I've sewn all the way around. So I've got my side seams, the seam that comes down the bottom that will actually just fold right under when we're doing our pockets, when we're attaching the pockets. So now I don't want to necessarily leave this raw edge. I'm going to turn this, and I'm going to stitch this down along the back. So I'm going to do the same thing one more time. I'm going to go over here, pin it, and I'm going to sew it. Now this is the way that we're going to do a few of the seams on here, including the robe front and the sleeves. So this same technique is one that we use for binding with Cuddle, but it also works really well for creating these little bands. So I'm going to take it over here. We're going to switch to a zigzag stitch. See which one that is, and make it a nice big zigzag. All right, so I'm doing a 4 and a 4, so it's 4 wide, 4 long zigzag, and I'm just going to go right across the edge of this, and it's going to hold it in place. And because it's Luxe Cuddle, it's going to actually just hide right in the stitches, and we should be fine. Okay, I'll take the pins out as I go, make sure that my edge stays nice and even here, hold it in place, and then just stitch that down. Do a little back stitch and take it out. So once we've got that stitch down, the zigzag is going to come right across here. You can go ahead and just scratch up all of this fluff and hide that stitching. You could also do this with a straight stitch if you want to. I like the zigzag because it leaves a little bit more of an open edge to it. And go ahead and make that nice and neat. Then you're going to make 2 of those and have your pockets ready. We'll set those aside. So we're going to do the same exact thing with the sleeves, except the sleeves are going to kind of go on the other direction where we have the sleeve and then the band. So the band is going to get sewn to the bottom of the sleeve. Make sure that my nap's going the right way, put these right sides together, and then pin them. We're going to pin an end, the middle, and then all the way down that edge again. So when I'm pinning this, I want to make sure that it's staying as even as possible. So if I pin an end and an end, I know that those match. So when I sew it, I know that they can match. So that means if it gets a little bit off, I can find ways of fixing it, which is usually just stopping, kind of readjusting your presser foot. If you need to lower your presser foot pressure, and you can do that, it's a great way of controlling the stretch as it goes. But actually pinning it this way helps a lot in preventing the stretch from happening in the first place. A lot of times people want to pin starting from here and then pin across, and as you do that, it's really easy to stretch it. And that's not what we want to do. So we want to kind of subdivide it up here. And because this is very stretchy, you can see it wants to move on me a little bit, I'm going to actually use that double row of pins the whole way. Okay. So I'm putting this first row of pins and kind of just dividing the sections up. And I'm going to go ahead and add a second row underneath it that will allow it to control it just a little bit more as I'm sewing, so that it won't push or stretch on me at all. So you can see it creates kind of a zigzag pattern as I go. So I'm pinning so that every area of the whole width of it is covered with a pin and holding it in position, which is really a game changer. If you are new to working with Cuddle, it's the way to make it behave for you. Makes it much easier. All right, so we're going to go ahead and stitch this whole seam with, again, with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, put it underneath my foot. Go ahead and do a little back stitch, securing that seam. Oops. Let's change it to a straight. There we go, 3.5 stitch length. Go ahead and back stitch and then go forward. So when I've got all these pins in there, it really does hold it much better and won't let it move too much at all. So take the time to do the double pinning. It really does make it easier. I always think it's easier to pin more at the beginning than it is to take any stitches out later. This is when I wish Jenny were here to take my pins again. And I can sew past any of these pins that I'm not going to hit, but if I'm going to hit them, I'm going to take them out because I want to make sure not to run over any of my pins. Okay. As we get to the end here, I can see that it's not moving too much on me at all, which is great. If it had started to move, I would need to stop, kind of readjust, and fix it. There's a little bit extra here at the end. I'm just going to kind of let that go. It's only maybe 1/4 inch. Totally fine. Okay, if it moves more than that, you'll want to fix things, but just a little bit is all right. So we're going to go ahead and clip our threads. And now we've got a sleeve. So it's not going to look like much right now, but I promise it will work just fine. If you want to make, so this creates a robe with a 3/4 sleeve to it. If you wanted to make a longer sleeve to it, you would add to the length here. So this is cut 7 inches. If you wanted to make it longer, you could do 10 inches and create a longer sleeve there. I've got 2 of those, so we're going to set those aside. We'll keep on going. All right, so next I'm going to be working with the robe front. So I'm going to lay this out so that I can pin. Because I'm right-handed, I want to pin so that I can pin this direction. If you're left-handed, you'll want to pin it the other direction. But we're going to lay this out, and again, I'm going to pin one end and then the other end, and then come back and pin the center. We're going to do the same thing. So, like I said, you're going to learn these skills that we're going to repeat over and over again, and you're going to be really good by the end of it. I'm going to bring my pins over, pin the center again, and then I'm just going to subdivide this so that I get it all nice and smooth. And this really does help to keep so that it does not kind of work its way across and seem like it's growing. So even though the Cuddle doesn't actually get longer, sometimes when people are working with it, they will think it does. This one is a little different too than the sleeve seam, because this one we're actually dealing with the lengthwise of the grain. We didn't talk about this at the beginning, but I can show you real quick that the stretch is widthwise and it doesn't stretch lengthwise. So this is the lengthwise grain, which means it's going to be an easier seam to sew and easier to pin as well. So I'll do the same thing here. Just kind of divide this up. And then add my second row of pins just to keep things in check for me so that they will stay more where I want them to. So this one I'm pinning a little further apart than I did for the sleeve, and that's because it's the lengthwise and not going to grow on me quite as much. Okay, so we'll take this over. We're doing another straight stitch. I'm going to go ahead, get it started just beyond the edge of it, and back stitch Get this nice and neat. So we're going to go ahead and backstitch. It should match at the beginning, and then hopefully if we did it right, we'll get to the end. All right, so we're just going to stitch down this edge. I've got my stiletto with me. It's kind of one of my favorite tools for working with Cuddle fabrics, and it's the by Annie stiletto. And really all it does is I kind of use it to hold the fabric down as it's going. If it starts to build up, I can kind of push it and let it kind of come underneath, and helps on the really long seams to keep the edges more even. Okay, one of the other things that if your machine will allow you to adjust the presser foot pressure, you can go ahead and lighten that and make it so that it will feed through a little bit faster and easier. Right? A lot of people don't know that feature is on their machine, so go ahead and make sure that you check your manual for your machine, see if you have an ability to change the presser foot pressure, and if you do, reduce it by a couple of notches and see if that helps sew the fabric a little bit easier for you. We want to make sure and keep the body of the fabric, the bulk of the fabric, up on the table. So that's another thing that's really important, so that it's not weighing down on me. Okay, it lets it ease through a lot easier, and not pull against the needle, because that's what's happening when it comes towards you, is it's kind of pulling on that needle, and it will make it feed through a little slower. We don't want that. You'll also notice that sometimes I can keep my hand behind the machine, but I'll sew with it. Keep my hand back here, keep a little tension on the fabric, and that will help sort of squish those two fabrics together. And that's all I'm really trying to do, is to squish the fabrics together, not really pulling it, but keeping them flat. Because they're two different lengths of nap, they tend to want to sit apart from each other, and this helps to keep it nice and even. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, get to the end, do a little back stitch. This time it didn't really grow at all on me, which is fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and take that out. Okay, now I've got all my pins. Let me see if I got them all taken out. Missing a couple there. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing that we kind of did with the sleeve and the pocket. Well, with the pocket, we'll do it with the sleeve later. But we sewed this on like we did those. Then we're going to turn this over, and we're going to put this down. So I will tell you that you can go ahead and you could stitch these together and redo this seam, but what that does is kind of leaves this ugly bulk of seams right here. So the way that we show you how to do it in the pattern, and the way I'll show you how to do it today, is we're going to cover that up and make it for a nice, neat finish right here. So these edges are going to come together. The raw edge is going to come right to the seam that we just sewed. And we're just going to pin right along this edge. I'm going to flip it because that's what I'm supposed to do. So it is easier to pin. And I'm going to flip this over and pin it every once in a while, and then come back and pin in between. So it's the same idea, is that we want to kind of control the stretch, make sure it's not stretching on me, not going places. And I'm just going to try to get that edge nice and even so that I can go back over and stitch it. And I'm pinning so that the pins are going to come this way. So when I stitch, it's just going to come right down. I'll take those pins out as I go and make sure not to hit any of them. Okay, so one of the other things that's really important when I'm doing this is to make sure that it's kind of pulled out, so we're not getting a fold in the front. If that happens, you can just leave it if it doesn't bother you, or come back and fix that. But if you kind of give it a little tug at the beginning, it's much less likely to catch that edge in there. Okay, and this is kind of the same technique that we use when we're doing binding with Luxe Cuddle. So the same idea of bringing it over to the stitching line, getting it to match neatly, pinning it in place. Same idea. So I'm going to go down to the end here, make sure that's in position, and then come back and do those middle bits so that I don't get it out of place. And this one I have less pins. One of the other things you can do is to pin in between out here a little bit. I'll show you. Just to keep that nice and flat and not let it come towards you. So here, I can kind of give this a tug, make sure it's going to be nice and flat, stick a pin out here. So it's a little bit like the double pinning, but for a totally different reason. But it does keep that edge nice and flat for me, so that I'm not going to actually get that tucked into my stitching when I come back over. So just keep that nice and neat. Give it a little tug. Make sure it matches. All right, so once I've got this whole edge pinned, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zigzag this whole thing down right along that stitching line. So when it comes over, the stitching should be right in my Luxe Cuddle on this side. So let's give it a shot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch my stitch over to a zigzag again. Make it a nice big zigzag this time. So we're going to bump it up to a 4 and a 4. All right, so that's going to cover a little bit more, and I'm really going to use my stiletto this time to hold the fabric where I want it to be. So I'm going to get it under here so that my needle, when it comes down on the left, is going to come right along the stitching line and right along the raw edge of the fabric. I'm going to hold that in position, put my foot down, and do a little zigzag. We're just going to hold that in position, and then I'm just going to zigzag down this whole edge, keeping that nice and flat. Okay, so we stitched the whole way. We're going to go ahead, do that same little fluffing up along the stitches here. Get it to kind of blend up a little bit. It will hide all of those zigzags for us. So we'll do that along the whole thing. We'll have the front ready to go. Okay, then you're going to trim it, and I've already got mine trimmed, but you're going to trim these together, and I want to show you how that is. On the side here, we're going to measure down 14 inches and then cut out 2 inches along the entire side of the robe. What this does is creates a little sleeve extension here. It's really important that when you get to this part that we do this so that they match. So I've got both robe fronts here, and they're going to go right sides together here. They're both stitched down, and the extension is the same on both sides. So I'm going to remind you to double check that and make sure that you're cutting it on the right spot, because it's really easy to get that wrong and cut out the sleeve extension in the wrong place. So make sure that you've got a left and a right. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and trim the neckline to create that front neckline for us. All right, so when we've got the patterns here for our front neck trim template. We also have a back neck, but we're going to put that aside for now because we want to make sure and just do the front. I want to lay these out so that they are wrong sides together. And I've got my sleeve extension over here, so I know that this is actually the top of my robe. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to separate them so that I am not going to confuse myself, and using one layer at a time of Cuddle is much easier than trying to do two. So I'm not going to cut these out at the same time. I'm going to do them separately. And I'm going to go ahead and mark this. See if I can get the blue to mark on there. Might be a little harder to see. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this here. And I can see my blue line there. Make sure I'm going to end in the right place. And there we go. Now this is just trash. We're going to throw that away. We're going to do the same thing on the other front. So now I know these are opposite because they lay together fine. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to match this top edge with the front edge so it's noted on there so that you make sure and get it right. Do the same thing. Mark it. And then go ahead and cut it out with the rotary cutter. So there's going to a little hiccup where there's so many layers right there, so just take your time with it. Use scissors if you need to. And go ahead and cut out both of those necklines. So now, if I lay these together, you'll see that this creates the front neckline of the robe. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and do the back template as well. All right, so now we've got the back piece and I've cut that and I've cut the same sleeve extensions on that as well. So 14 inches down and then 2 inches off that side to create the sleeve extensions. So now I've got a wide back piece. So I'm going to fold this in half because I'd rather deal with the wrong side of the fabric when I'm doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and fold this in half. Get my edges to match here and over here. This is the only part I'm really worrying about is this top part. And I'm going to go ahead and put my little template on here and mark that again. So it marks top edge, center. I'm going to have to flip this over to make it match here. I'm going to go ahead and draw that right along there. So the other thing I want to do while I'm here is I want to go ahead and mark this center. And I'm going to mark that there. So I can, whoops. I was going to open that up, but I can actually go ahead and cut this with scissors while it's folded. You can also open it up. If you are working with Luxe Cuddle, you should open it up and trace it on both sides. But with the print, it's thin enough that if I cut it like this, we're okay. So I'm going to go ahead, cut that, and there's my back neck template. Now I've got my back done. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew my front to my back. And I'm just going to pin this right along the top. Now I'm going to try to get this to match as well as I can. I really should have a pin cushion, but I forget these a lot of times. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pin at one end, pin over here, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin in between, just as I've done before. And I'm going to do that double row of pins because this is a stretchy side. This is the width of fabric, so it's going to move on me a little extra. So I'll go ahead and throw a few extra pins so that it doesn't get away from me. I'll sew right across the top with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're on a straight stitch, 3.5 stitch length. I'm going to go ahead and run this right along that edge. Give myself a nice seam. All right. So even though that seemed like it might be just the tiniest bit off as I sewed it, it works out perfectly fine. And I'm going to do that to both shoulders. And when we're sewing with this, we always try to want to keep as much on the table, but really the only part that we want to keep super flat is right here where we're actually going to be sewing it. So don't worry if it's kind of bunched up over here. We just want it to be nice and flat where we're going to sew it. Again, pinning in sort of at like a 45-degree angle for those places that I want it to stay really nice, and then pinning in between. I love my myriad of pins, I have to say. All right, I'm going to go ahead and sew again a 1/2 inch seam allowance right along the top. All right, so now we've got both shoulder seams sewn together. This for me is where it starts to get a little bit crazy because it just seems like a lot of fabric and I have to try to keep it in check as to what I'm doing. But if we lay this out, you can kind of see what we've got. As we've got the back of our robe and the two fronts of the robe, the left and the right front. All right, so now we're going to sew on our sleeves. So we did those earlier. Sewed the band onto the sleeve, and that's going to go onto this sleeve extension here. So I've got one for each side, obviously. Like I said, I go ahead and I usually mark all of my pieces with what they are so I can kind of keep myself in check. I'm going to put these on right sides together, matching the body fabric. So whatever we've chosen to do for the body, they're going to match those right sides together. We're going to do the same thing where we pin an end, pin an end, pin in the middle. Keep on going. Okay, so one end, the other. And then we're going to go ahead, pin in the middle. And I'm going to try to open up that seam allowance. And I'm going to pin that so it stays open. If it doesn't stay open as you're sewing it, it's no big deal. So when you're sewing this, make sure that you've got all of the weight of your robe up on the table. So this might be a good time to move to the kitchen table. Keep all the weight up there. It'll make it much, much easier to sew. I'm just going to sew along this whole thing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now once we've gotten both sleeves sewn on, I brought it back to the table and you can see it's kind of a lot of fabric again. So we're just trying to keep this in check. So I'm going to lay it out so we can see where we are. So don't get too intimidated by the amount of fabric that it seems like when you're sewing this. It always is a little intimidating for me, but it will make sense. We have our sleeves coming out to the sides, our robe front down here, and our robe back here. So as we see this, it'll start to come together where I can see my front, my sleeves. Okay, so this next part, we're actually going to sew this side seam is what we want to do. Now, sometimes when you're sewing, this will happen and you'll get a little extra, and I will tell you my secret is to just trim it off. So as long as it's just a little bit, we're okay. I'm going to go ahead and use my scissors, and I'm just going to trim this so that it matches. It's close enough. It's my theory on it. It will work out just fine. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to match up my seams. As you can imagine, we're not going to be super careful with it. If it doesn't match perfectly, it's fine. But we're going to do our best to make these match, and we're going to get our seam allowances to both go toward the band on the sleeve. So I'm actually going to pin them right before and after that seam. And that seems to help when I'm sewing this to get it to stay in the direction that I want it to, because it's a lot of layers. If you are dealing with a machine that doesn't want to sew over this, you can hand crank it, or you can flip them in opposite directions, but it will make it easier when we sew the sleeve band down if they are going toward the band. Okay, so I'm going to come down here. I'm going to pin all the parts I want to match first. So I'm going to go ahead and pin that seam. And then I'm going to worry about the corner. So I'm going to lay this down so that I can get it to be where I want it to be, get it nice and flat, and go ahead and pin in at an angle here so I can make it stay. Then I'm going to pin a few more times down this side. Okay, and sometimes I'll pin parallel and sometimes I pin perpendicular. It really depends on how long that seam is. This is just a little spot, so I pinned the other direction. And now I'm going to pin this way to keep that in better, to make it stay better where I want it to stay. Okay, same right here. Then I'm going to pin this parallel. And then I'll go ahead and do this to both sides, just sewing the sleeve. So we're going to start in at the corner here, about a 1/2 inch past the raw edge, and I'm just going to sew all the way down here. Then we'll go ahead and do it to the other side as well. Okay, so I'm going to drop my needle down about where I think that 1/2 inch line is. And I'll be able to go back and catch that. If I'm wrong, it'll be totally fine. I'm going to back stitch just a couple of stitches just to secure that really nicely. Then go ahead and stitch down this side. ahead and take these pins out, and then we're going to sew the side seams. So we sew those in 2 different steps so that you can actually keep it in the right position that you need it to without it growing too much in either way. So we're sewing the short, sort of stretchy side first and keeping that in position, and then we're going to go ahead and sew the long lengthwise seams now. These are our side seams. We're just going to make sure that they match at the top, match at the bottom, and pin in between. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew from the seam that we ended here, or we started here in the armpit of the robe, and we're going to sew from there all the way down to the hem. Now I'm going to go ahead and back stitch right here, make sure we've got that nice and secure. It's going to be one point that can get a little bit of stress on this, so we're going to back stitch. Make sure both seams match, and then just stitch all the way down the side. So now we've got one of the sides sewn. We're going to do the same thing to the other side. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and clip the seam here where they kind of join together. I want to clip the fabric, I'm going to do it one layer at a time, up to that stitching line and not through the stitching line, but that will allow it to have some freedom of movement in the sleeve. So now we've got both side seams sewn. I'm going to go ahead and trim that seam at the corner as well on this side. Trim some of my extra threads that are hanging around. And go ahead and trim right in here and here to give it again that flexibility in the armpit. So now we can start seeing that it is becoming a robe. So it's starting to have a little bit of shape, which is always kind of fun. And I can start seeing it become something. But we need to finish off these sleeve bands, so we're going to do that next. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to flip this inside out, because what I want to do is finish this the same way that we did the robe front. We're going to turn this, match the seam allowances, and top stitch it in place. So what I'm doing is I'm just lining up the raw edge here with the stitching line from before and pinning it in position so that I can go ahead and top stitch that. So I top stitched it all the way around. We're going to go ahead and flip it over, turn it inside out. We're going to do that to both sides. Finish up the sleeves and give them a little fluffing to hide all of those little zigzags. Okay, if you want, like I said, you could also fold this over and just stitch it into the seam allowance, or you could top stitch or hand stitch this in place to hide any of these stitches as well. All right, and we'll do it to the other side. All right, so we've got our robe, got it turned it right side out. Yes, we've turned it right side out. So now I'm just going to set this aside and work on the hood. We're going to need the hood sides here, and then this is the band. We're going to go ahead and sew the sides together. You're going to do those in pairs, and you'll have 2 pairs of them. So I'm going to go ahead and lay these together, and I'm going to pin the important parts just like I did before. On the other parts that I want to match, I'm going to pin those first. So on this one, it's going to be this corner up here at the top, the mark here on the side, and this bottom corner. Then I'm going to go ahead and pin in between there just a little bit, just to keep it in position as I'm sewing, because it's going to want to move on me just a little bit, mostly because it's a shape here. So this is a lengthwise seam, so that's not going to move on me too much, but because we've got a big curve here, I'm actually going to pin perpendicular just around this curve. I found that that works best for curves on Cuddle fabric. So now I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to do that for both sides. I need to get to a straight stitch. 3.5 stitch length. I'm going to stitch forward, backward, and all the way around. Again, we're going to back stitch and cut our thread. So now we're going to be able to flip this. Let that be a round curve. And because it is Cuddle fabric, we don't actually have to clip this curve to let it be smooth. It totally works just fine. Then we're going to go ahead and sew the band on to both sides of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the center of the band. And I want to mark that. So I've gone ahead and marked it here. Fold it in half is all I'm going to do. Fold it in half, mark the center. You're going to do the same thing on the ends. Is fold them in half and mark the center. We're going to use those marks later to match it to the front of the robe. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to match the center mark that I did here for the width of it and match that to the seam on the hood. So I'm going to go ahead and put those right sides together, pin it in position, and then pin all the way around. So this one won't match up perfectly. Generally, when we've been pinning these together, we want to pin the important parts, which would be where it matches, and the end. But this one is actually going to be slightly longer. So I'm just going to lay these two together, get them to fit as well as they can, and put a pin in there. So we have some flexibility with this, and I'll show you why when we get there. But just know that it isn't going to match perfectly, and that's right. Okay, it should not match perfectly. Do not stretch it to make it match. Instead, we're just going to let it be there. I'm going to go ahead and pin this whole edge and then sew this down. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other edge of the hood. I'm going to lay it together here. Get this to lay out. Should be about the same overlap on either side. I'll pin that there and then go ahead and do my pinning in between. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance again. Okay. So as I'm sewing it around here, you'll notice that I keep kind of trying to keep the hood nice and even, and that's important to keep it flat underneath here because it has shape. We want to keep it even as I'm sewing all the way around. So I'll keep futzing with it to make sure that it stays there. So once we've sewn it around one side, we'll do the same thing with the other side. So I had a pin still left. Let's check that, make sure. One more. Okay, now we'll go ahead, flip it. Then we'll go ahead and sew the other side on as well. Okay, so once both sides of your hood are sewn on, it's going to look like this, which is a little bit funny and definitely can be a little disconcerting when you're sewing. So this is right. We're going to go ahead and fold this so that the inside, there's an inside hood and an outside hood. We want to fold it along this mark that we made earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to stick a pin in here so that it will make it easy for me to fold against that line. I'm going to do the same thing here, just because it's easier to fold against the pin. So go ahead, twist it. You get to pick which one is the inside, the outside. So depending on which one you like better, you can also line it with a Luxe Cuddle on the inside and a print on the outside, whichever way you'd like to do. So I'm going to go ahead and pin my back together. Smooth that all out. And now I've got these sort of funny bits down here at the end of the hood. And this is what it's actually supposed to look like, so it's not wrong. So we're just going to pin this right here, hold it together, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a little curve right here to just even it up and give a little swoop in here. So it should not be a hard edge, but kind of a little swoop that we're going to do. But it really is just kind of a free cut there. Okay, so now I've got these little curves at the end. I've still got my little marks that are showing, that shows me where my center front is, hopefully, yes, on both. Okay, so this little mark is going to come into play next as we attach the hood onto the body of the robe. So before we attach the hood to the body, one of the things that I like to do is I'm going to go ahead on the inside piece of my hood and I'm going to stitch a quarter or a half an inch line, kind of like a stay stitching line that will just be a guide. So it's through one layer of the fabric, and all it's going to be is a guideline for me later to fold this under to stitch. Okay, so I've done that first, and I'm going to go ahead and connect this to the robe. So this center seam in the back, the outer hood center seam, is going to go on the mark of the robe backing here. So we're going to match these two together. So I've marked the center back. If you want to, you can put a little grosgrain ribbon in here for holding. That is totally optional. I'm going to go ahead and pin these so that they match and stay in position. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to match the center mark of the hood band with the center fold of the robe front. So I'm going to get those to match right here. Line them up real well, and then pin them in position. Then I'll go ahead and make this all ease together along the edge here. And I'm going to go ahead and parallel pin this because I'm going to pin it a bunch, and I want it to stay together for me. More importantly, in the position that it is, and because it has a curve, it's easier to pin it perpendicular. Note that it will sometimes roll on you, so just be gentle and do not stretch the fabric. Because Cuddle is a knit, the more you stretch it, the more it will curl. So sometimes that's what will happen here, is if people aren't gentle with it, it'll curl a little bit. So I'm going to pin some, and then I will ease and then pin some more. So I may end up taking some pins out, repositioning, and that's pretty normal as I kind of try to just ease this in. One of the other things I'll do is do this where I pin from one side and then the other, and that will help fight that curl that tends to happen too. And it's just a little way of keeping it all in check. Okay, so there's a little bit of opposite pinning here that will hold it nice and flat. I'm going to do this to this side. I'm going to smooth that out just a little because I don't want it quite that pointy. And then I'm going to get this to match here, right along that edge, pin that in position, and then go ahead and ease this in as well. Okay, so now I'm going to sew this from center mark of the hood across to the other center mark of the hood, 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sew that down. So one of the things that I'll do when I'm sewing this hood on is I have to take it nice and slow, but I also want to make sure that the robe that is underneath, there's a little bit more volume to the robe than there is to the hood. So I'm trying to make sure with my left hand that that fabric stays nice and flat and that it isn't getting any puckers underneath. If it does, I can go back and fix it if it's obnoxious. If it doesn't really show, I might just... So now we've gotten it to here, matches along the front. The goal is to get the trim on the front to match the trim of the hood. Doesn't always match. That one worked out pretty well. That one is a little bit off. So that's sometimes what happens. It's your choice on how much you want to care about that. My position is that it's soft, it's yummy, it'll all be okay. So I'm going to go ahead and where I've done the stay stitching here, I'm going to turn this under and I'm going to match my center hood to my center hood seam. And I'm just going to put this here, make it match, and pin it in position. With some sharper pins. Okay, there we go. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing here, flip this underneath and bring it around and pin that in position as well. And then I'm just going to even this up all the way, line it up along that seam line, and we're going to top stitch it down just like we did with the other bands. We'll sew that on. If you prefer, you can actually hand stitch this down, just do a little slip stitch, stitch it in place, or go ahead and we're just going to zigzag it in position. Make sure all of this is tucked in and exactly where I want it. Use my little stiletto and just push it in. With the zigzag, it's going to be easy to come back and kind of fluff that up and make it work just fine. All right, we'll go ahead and take that out. Cut my threads. And now we're basically done. We're just going to add a couple of little extra bits. So we've got the hood is sewn on here, so here's the zigzag from the other side. You can totally match your thread and make it not so noticeable. If you use the Luxe Cuddle, it'll totally hide in there as well. But even with this, this is mostly going to be seen behind your hood. Okay, so here's your hood. Can we try it on? See how this works, because the next part, we actually do need to try it on and see how it fits. All right, so then the next thing we need to do is figure out where our belt loops and our pocket should be. So what I want to do is kind of hoof my shoulders up, figure out where my waistline is. I'm going to stick a pin in there so that I know that this is where I want my belt loop to be. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off. And then what I'm going to do is measure that from the armpit seam down to where my pin is. So I'm just going to use the board to measure that. It's about 8 inches, so I'm going to move my pin to exactly 8 inches. And I'm going to mark the same thing over here, and then we're going to prepare the belt loops. So go ahead and measure this to 8 inches. I'm going to stick a pin in. And then we'll come back and put those on there. So I've got my belt loop piece, which is 13 inches by 2.5 inches. It is cut lengthwise on the fabric, so there's no stretch here. The stretch is this direction, which is great. It's exactly what we want because we want this to not have stretch as it goes down the side of the robe. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew this, or I'm going to pin it so that it comes up about here, folds over to around the halfway. So you could measure this. It ends up being about 1 inch. But I kind of just eyeball it, fold it over, and just make sure that that raw edge is down the center. Okay, this is the easiest way to sew a little strap or loop if you want to do it with the Cuddle, because turning it inside out isn't as easy when it's this small. So that's why we do it this way. Super duper easy to do this, and we're just going to go ahead and stitch it right down the center there. I'm going to do a slightly smaller zigzag than I was doing before, so it's going to be a little bit, let me change this one because I want it to be a little bit narrower, but just as long. So I'm going to switch it to a 2.5 wide and a 4 long. And then I'm just going to stitch right down the middle of this, catching that raw edge in the zigzag. So once I've sewn it down the middle, I'm going to go ahead and just cut it in half so that I have 2 equal belt loops. If your ends are a little funky, you can go ahead and cut them off. So when I fold it in half, it's not quite perfect. You can use the rotary, you can use the scissors, either one. Just cut them, make 2 equal belt loops, and now we're going to pin those onto the robe. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up so that the side seam here is just one layer, and I'm not going to catch anything else, because when I pin this on and sew it, I want to make sure that it is only to the robe side that it's supposed to be on. So I like to go ahead and I sew this on with the belt loop facing up first. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this here. And I'm going to pin it kind of in 2 positions here so that I can actually sew along here and it won't shift. For one thing I found when sewing with Cuddle is if I use only 1 pin, it has more likely to shift around here. I want it to stay nice and tight, so I'm going to use 2 pins, keeping it straight up that side seam there. And I'm going to sew this, and then we'll bring it around and sew it to the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and still use my small stitch for this part, and then I'm going to come back and stitch it again to give it a little extra strength. So I'll back stitch, stitch across, with my pin still in there, holding it nice and tight where I want it to be. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to move this so that I'm going to stitch over a little bit, catch a little bit more with that same zigzag. So this one I'm just lining it up with the edge of the foot, so it'll probably be about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to let it stitch right there. Stitch that down again, and I'm going to stitch all the way across twice just to really secure that spot so that it doesn't come loose when it gets tugged on, because being a belt, part of the belt loop, it's going to get some stress. So I'll go ahead and cut these threads. Pull that out from underneath. I cut the bottom threads. Then I'm actually just going to leave it here, switch it over, and zigzag the other part down. So what I want to do, let me put this back into the machine so it's a little easier for me. So I'm going to fold this over. So here's my belt loop. Okay, so we've got my belt loop, and I'm just going to bring this over so that it comes down. But I don't want to keep it perfectly flat because the belt loop needs a little bit of extra room. So I'm just going to kind of pull it over flat and then pull it up just a little bit. Hold it in position and stitch it down. So if I get it over here and I can kind of line up my stitches that I did right down the middle, get that lined up with the center seam, then I'm going to go forward, backward, a couple of times here and get this nice and secure. Same way we did before. So this one I'm stitching down right along that raw edge. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move it over just the tiniest bit and stitch it down across again and back, just to secure that really well. Okay, and we'll go ahead and take that out. So then we're going to put the pocket on after we've gotten the belt loops on. And I'm going to go ahead and take the pocket, lay it on there. So when you put your pockets on, it's a good idea to give it a try it on, put your pockets on, position it. I like my pockets a couple inches away from my side seam and pretty parallel to my, or pretty in check with my belt loops, because I want my belt to come through here and my pocket will be just below it. So I want to make sure that my pocket isn't in the middle of my belt loop, because that's not going to work very well. So I suggest putting your belt loop on, then put your pockets on. See how you like it to fit. I pin the side first, making sure that it stays nice and even with my side seam. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of pins in there just to hold it and make sure that it's parallel. You can go ahead and use a ruler if you'd like, or just eyeball it. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Just make sure that it's nice and straight, and then pin it all in position. And where I'm folding this is right along that little line that we sewed at the beginning when we sewed around the pocket. That's what this little fold line is. Works very nicely to keep it exactly where I want it to be, and gives it a nice straight line to fold on. When you're working with knit fabric, sometimes it's hard to get a straight fold, so this little trick works really nicely to get that to fold under really well. I'm going to get to the corners here. We're going to fold it down and then fold it under. Give it a little stretch. Put it in the right spot. Make sure that it's nice and straight and that those seam allowances are going to be hidden. There we go. Tuck that under and stick a pin through. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and stitch that down. Okay, so now I'm going to take it over. We're going to do a straight stitch all the way around the pocket. If you're doing this with Luxe Cuddle, you can actually do a zigzag all the way around if you like, but I like the straight stitch. Makes it nice and easy, and we'll do a couple of little reinforcing stitches up at those corners. So I'm going to make sure that nothing is folded underneath, so the bulk of my robe is going to be over on the table. And I'm going to get this underneath here and make sure I'm just sewing the pocket on. I'm going to sew it real close to the edge. I'm going to change this to, I said I was going to change it to a straight stitch and I didn't. There we go. Okay, so with this one I'm going to do it with a straight stitch and move it up to a 3.5 stitch length. We're going to go forward just a little bit. We're going to go forward just a little bit. So say 4 stitches. I'm going to lift my foot up and I'm going to sew backward in a little triangle. Okay. I'm going to turn it just slightly and come back to where I was. What this does, and we're going to do it at both ends, is it will actually reinforce that pocket so that when you're pulling on it, it's not going to actually pull out of your fabric. So it works much better to hold it together really nice and strong with that little reinforcing stitch. So now I've gone back to the beginning. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to straight stitch all the way around, right along the edge. I'm going to try to keep an even seam so that the top stitch looks nice on there. But because it's Cuddle, it's totally going to hide. Okay, so as I come down here, I'm going to make sure I'm holding it nice and tight to try to get those stitches to hide that I did earlier, the stay stitching. If they show, you can always just take them out. It's a nice big stitch. So you can totally grab that, cut the thread, grab it, pull it on out. It's totally fine. It's really just a basting stitch for you. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kind of push this under with my stiletto and stitch along that edge. One more time. Get to the corner, we'll turn again. So just get up to the corner where you want to pivot, drop the needle, turn it, and now we're going to have a whole lot of fabric in the front because we're coming up the other side. So we need to be careful, kind of carefully move it and make sure you're trying to keep as much of the weight off of the machine as possible. So that includes keeping it on the table, keeping it in your lap, and into the throat of the machine. Okay, and we're just going to stitch up this other side. And as we get up to the corner here, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the other side, except I'm going to turn it this way, go just a couple of little stitches, and I'm just going to hand crank those couple of stitches, and then I'm going to lift my foot, pivot, and head back to the edge in a triangle. Because this is in the Cuddle fabric, you're never going to see it, so it's not going to cause any issues. If it's not pretty, it's just going to be hidden in there. No big deal, but it will reinforce your pocket, so it's much less likely to ever pull the fabric and cause any problems. Okay. Now we'll pull all of this out. So here's what it's going to look like once you've got that secure stitching down with a little triangle at the top. It's going to hold it nice and tight for your pocket. Okay. So if I flip it over here, see if I can get some of this thread out of the way. So from this side, you're not going to be able to see that triangle at all because it's all hidden right in here in the little pocket or in the Luxe Cuddle. No big deal, and it will make your pocket nice and secure. You're going to do that on both sides with a belt loop and the pocket. For the belt, I've cut two pieces that are 4.5 by 40 inches. So it ends up being an 80-inch long belt that we're going to use. It's a great length for just about everybody, and I really like the way that this is put together. So we're going to cut these two lengthwise strips, and we're going to sew them together to create one long piece. So I'm going to put them so that the nap is running from one into the other, because that's the way we're going to sew them. Then I'll turn it right sides together. Pin this a couple times and sew that. Okay, so we're going to pin it just a few little times. Go ahead and stitch this. So go ahead and back stitch it. Sew all the way across and back stitch again. So now we have a long belt piece. So we're going to go ahead and fold this in half. The first thing I want to do is create a little turning gap for when we sew this together that we can turn it out that hole. I like to generally use one that's about the size of my hand. For something this long, I'm actually going to give it a little bit wider and use kind of the palm of my hand. And I'm just going to mark it with a pin. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark the same thing on the other side, so that these two will correspond. So I'm only pinning through one side and just as a mark for myself. Okay, and that's actually almost a 5-inch gap that we left. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew down either one of these sides to do what we call stay stitching that will help to create that turning gap and make it work really nicely. And now we'll sew down the other side with a matching stay stitching line. And they don't have to be perfect because they're going to be used and kind of match with the seam allowance on this next step. So I've gone ahead and I've got the stay stitching along both sides that pretty well correspond, and then I'm going to fold this in half the long way here and start pinning this. So again, matching the important parts, which is going to be this center seam and then my end points. So the corner here is going to get matched. And then the stay stitching lines will get matched. And then we'll start working in between. Okay, because this is actually a lengthwise seam, it's a little bit easier to sew. So we're going to do a little less pinning than we would if it were widthwise, but we're still going to do a little bit of double pinning just to keep things in position. All right, so if you are pinning this and you've forgotten which way you've cut this, we don't need to pin as much when it's lengthwise. You can give it a little stretch and you can see it's not going to go anywhere because this is the lengthwise grain. If I stretch it this way, it's totally going to stretch because this is widthwise of the fabric. So there is something to remember there. Once you've cut it, sometimes it's easy to forget which way you originally cut it. So you can just give it a little stretch and see if it stretches, that's the widthwise. If it doesn't stretch, that's your lengthwise. So first I'm going to sew this seam half an inch all the way down the length of the belt. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch there and then just stitch all the way to the other end. All right, so we're going to stitch all the way down till we get to the place where we left, or we started that little stay stitching line. Where we did that, we're going to stop right there and try to make it match. Leave the needle down, put my foot up, take some pins out of the way, pivot, and then I'm just going to sew right off the edge. Foot down. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start again. Okay, so we sewed off one end, we're going to come back to the other. And I'm going to start at the other end of the stay stitching line and put my needle down, pivot, sew off that edge with the foot down. Then I'm just going to back stitch to where I started there and then sew down to the other end. So now we've got this long tube with our turning hole in here, but we didn't sew the end shut, and that's because we want to actually twist this so that the ends, this is in the center, so our seam allowances are in the center. This makes the belt lay a little bit better when we do it this way. So we're going to go ahead and just turn that and then sew the ends closed. So we're going to pin that down, sew across, sew across. So now I've got my secret tool for turning this inside out. So you could use all sorts of things, even just your hand, but I really love having just a big knitting needle that I can stick in the end here Just push it through. And it's going to pop right out the little turning gap. We'll do the same thing on the other end. I'm actually going to push those corners out a little bit more and then push it through. There we go. And there's your belt. Now we can go ahead and hand stitch this guy closed, or we can take it to the machine and zigzag it. So I'm going to show you how to do that. If you want to make sure that it's super neat, you can absolutely hand stitch it. But for something like this, it's just as easy to zigzag it closed. So I'm going to zigzag this with a 3.5 zigzag, so 3.5 long, 3.5 wide, and just grab that edge, catch both sides, close it up. So once we've got the belt done, if you want to go ahead, you could top stitch it just around the edges. I think it looks really nice. If you're doing that with a Cuddle 3, you might want to top stitch it, or you could do that right down the middle with a serpentine on the Luxe Cuddle, or just leave it as is, which works perfectly fine. Okay, so now that we've got the belt done, we've got pockets on, we've got the belt loops, we're ready to go, we're almost finished, we just need to hem it. So now we're going to hem the bottom of the robe. At this point, you could try it on, see how you like it, decide what hem length you want. You could definitely cut it shorter. Next time you can make it a little longer if you wanted to. But the easiest way to hem this, we call for a 1.5 inch hem in the pattern, and the easiest way to hem this is to mark a 3 inch line on your hem. So we're going to fold it up 1.5 inches, which means we're going to fold it up to the 3 inch line. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark this with a water-soluble marker that I can easily remove later when I wash it, or I give it a little spritz with water. I'm going to mark this whole hemline at 3 inches. Speaking of washing, you're going to want to make sure that you wash this correctly. So Cuddle fabric is 100% polyester microfiber plush fabric, and it should be washed in cold water. You can dry it, but make sure that you dry it with low heat. Works best, especially with Luxe Cuddle, if you take it out before it's completely dry. And then make sure that when you're washing it, you don't use any sort of fabric softeners. Fabric softeners tend to cling to the fibers and will make it look sort of old and worn a lot faster than it should. So make sure you don't use any fabric softeners, cold water, and a low heat dryer. Okay, so I've marked it all the way across here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just fold this up to that line. So we're still sort of using that same technique that we were using before. So we want to take the raw edges, fold them to a line, make them match, and stitch them down. So I'm going to do that across the whole thing here, matching up the raw edge to that line that I just drew. And like I said, make sure that you use an erasable fabric marker that isn't going to stay on there forever. Try to fold that up so it matches nicely. Pin that in position. And work my way across. So now this hem, we can do this with a couple of different stitches. We can do it with a zigzag, we could do it with a straight, we could do it with a serpentine. Whatever you've used the most of or whatever you like the look of best, that's what I'm going to suggest you do, especially when you're using a Cuddle print. The stitch is going to show on this part. I'm going to go ahead and use a straight stitch on this, but you are absolutely welcome to use a serpentine or a zigzag, like I said. Just depends on what you want to do. So now that I've got it all pinned, I'm going to take it over to the machine and stitch all the way across that hem. Okay, so again, I'm using a straight stitch, 3.5 stitch length. I'm going to go backward first and then go forward. I'm going to find a place on my machine to kind of look at to make sure that my hem stays fairly even. Once I get to the cuddle part, I'll be able to see where that edge is much better. And on the Luxe Cuddle, it kind of hides in there. All right, and now we're just going to follow right along that edge and straight stitch it down. I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't fold up or push forward too much. Take our time with it. Just stitch all the way across. So now I'm going to go ahead, clip my thread. Make sure all my threads are clipped along the way. It's all nice and hemmed and ready to go. Thank you so much for joining me today to make this lovely, cozy cuddle robe. I'm looking forward to doing more tutorials here at Missouri Star Quilt Company using Shannon Fabrics Cuddle, and I hope you'll join me.
Hi everybody, it's Jenny from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. We hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you aren't already part of the Missouri Star Quilt Company family, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss a thing. And if you click that bell, it'll notify you every time a new tutorial comes out. See you next Friday.